My aunt called me on a Thursday in February to ask if I knew what my father had been doing. I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Your grandfather has been sick for 3 years," she said. "Your father has been handling everything," she said. "The doctor appointments, the bills, the visiting 3 times a week, the managing of the house," she said. "I did not know any of this until last month when the hospice nurse mentioned it," she said. "Your father never told me. He never told his other sister. He never told your mother," she said. "I called him to ask why he had not told us," she said. "He said he did not want it to be about him." I called my father an hour after I hung up with my aunt. He answered and I said, "I need to talk to you about Grandpa Thomas." I want to say something about the call with my father and about what he had said when I had asked about the 3 years. His name is Robert. He is 58 years old. I said, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He was quiet for a long time. He said, "I want to tell you something about that." He said, "I did not tell anyone because the telling would have changed the form of the doing." He said, "If I had told your aunt, the doing would have become the doing that your aunt knew about." He said, "The doing I wanted was the doing that was between me and your grandfather." He said, "I did not want the doing to be the announced form." He said, "The announced form changes what the doing is." He said, "The doing I wanted was not the announced form." He said, "I wanted it to be the form I was in with him." He said, "That form required the quiet." I am a seismologist. I have been working for 5 years at a geophysical research center in Denver, Colorado, where I study the seismic activity of the Rocky Mountain region, the specific work of understanding the faults, the stress accumulation, the seismic events that the accumulated stress eventually produces. My work requires the specific attention to what is happening beneath the surface before the surface shows it, the deep structure that the seismic waves reveal, the slow accumulation of the strain that the fault is building across the years of the quiet period. I had been doing this work for 5 years. The Thursday call had arrived in me in the professional language. My father had been accumulating the care for 3 years in the deep, quiet form, the strain building in the specific relationship between him and his father, without the surface showing anything that anyone above the fault line could read. I want to say something about my father and about who he had been in the form I had known him across 31 years, and about what the Thursday call had given me for understanding the fuller form he had been in the form I had known him, the specific form of the organized and competent man who managed the practical matters of the family in the quiet way, not the dramatic form, the form that gets things done without the announcement. The mortgage had been managed. The car problems had been managed. The specific practical form of the competent and quiet had been his form across the 31 years I had known him. I had received the competent and quiet form as his form. The 3 years of the grandfather care had been the competent and quiet form at the largest scale I had yet understood. The 3 years had been the form I had known expressed at the scale that the scale had required. I had known the form at the small scale. The Thursday call had given me the form at the large scale. The large scale had changed what I understood the form to be, not the ordinary competence, the specific form of the love that does not announce itself. Before I go on, if something in this story is landing close to something real in your life, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. My name is Ines. I am 31 years old. I'm a seismologist in Denver, Colorado. And this is the story of the Thursday call and what my father told me about the 3 years of the quiet care and what my grandfather told me in his last months and what I have come to understand about the form of the love that does the work without requiring the knowing of the doing. I want to say something about the full account my father gave me in the call after I said I needed to talk about Grandpa Thomas. He had been quiet and then had said, "I want to give you the full account." He had said, "Your grandfather was diagnosed 3 years ago." He had said, "The diagnosis was the form that required the management." He had said, "I had been the closest of his children in the practical sense, the closest in the city, the one with the schedule that permitted the doing of the managing." He had said, "I started managing." He had said, "I managed the first doctor appointment and understood that the managing would be the form required across the time the form was required." He had said, I did not tell anyone because the telling would have produced the distributed form. He had said, "The distributed form is the form in which many people know, and each person contributes the portion they can." He had said, "The distributed form is a real form, and I'm not saying the distributed form is the wrong form." He had said, "The form I wanted was the concentrated form." He had said, "I wanted the managing to be mine to do." He had been quiet. He had said, "I want to tell you why I wanted it to be mine." He had said, "The managing of your grandfather's last years was the form I had for being with him." He had said, "The doing was the being with him form that was available to me." He had said, "I did not want to distribute the being with him." I had said, "Yes." He had said, "Yes." I want to say something about the seismology parallel and about what the fault mechanics had given me for understanding the 3 years of the quiet care. In seismology, the fault is the fracture in the rock across which the displacement occurs during the seismic event. The fault accumulates the strain across the years of the interseismic period. The locked fault sections build the elastic strain as the tectonic plates continue to move while the fault is locked. The strain accumulates silently. The surface above the locked fault shows nothing of the accumulation below. The buildings are still standing. The landscape is the same. The accumulation is happening in the deep structure below the surface expression. When the accumulated strain exceeds the fault strength, the rupture occurs. The stored energy is released in the seismic event. The surface expression appears. The 3 years of the care had been the interseismic period of my father's relationship with his father, the strain of the love and the doing accumulating in the deep structure of the relationship below the surface that anyone else could read. No one at the surface had known. The accumulation had been real in the deep structure the whole time. I want to say something about my grandfather Thomas, and about who he had been in the form I had known him, and about what the 3 years had produced in the form of the relationship between him and my father. His name is Thomas. He is 81 years old. He has been in the form of the person with the dignity that the 81-year-old man who has been in the work form his whole life carries, the specific quality of the person who built the form from the available materials across the years. He had been a carpenter for 40 years. He had built things. The things he had built were still standing in various places across the city. The specific quality of the dignity had been the form he had carried across the visits I had made growing up. The grandfather who sat at the head of the table in the specific form of the person who had earned the seat. The 3 years of the illness had been the form that the earned the seat person is in when the illness arrives. The managing of the transition from the form he had been in to the form the illness produced. My father had been the person managing that transition alongside him. My father had been at the table and in the appointments and in the specific form of the being there that the transition required. The 2 men had been in the transition together. I had not known about the being in the transition together. The Thursday call had told me. I had called my aunt after the call with my father. Her name is Donna. She is 55 years old. She lives in Denver and had been in the form of the person who had just found out about the 3 years and who was in the process of understanding what the 3 years had been. She had answered and I had said, "I spoke with Dad." She had been quiet. She had said, "I want to tell you something about what I found out from the hospice nurse." She had said, the hospice nurse had been coordinating the care for the last 4 months. She had said, the hospice nurse had asked about the family and had said, "Your brother Robert has been the primary contact for 3 years." She had said, "I had not known." She had been quiet. She had said, "I want to tell you what I said to your father when I called him." She had said, "I told him I was hurt." She had said, "I told him he should have told us." She had been quiet. She had said, he said, "I understand you are hurt." He had said, "The hurt is real." He had said, "I want to tell you something about why I did not tell you." She had said, "He told me the same thing he told you. The quiet form, the form that was between him and your grandfather, the not wanting to announce." She had been quiet. She had said, "I want you to know something about what he said after that." She had said, he said, "I am sorry I did not give you the chance to be part of this." He had said it in the specific form of the apology that does not manage. She had been quiet. She had said, "I am receiving the apology." She had said, I wanted to tell you that. I want to say something about visiting my grandfather in March, 1 month after the Thursday call, and about what the visit had been in the form of the first visit with the fuller picture. He had been in the house he had been in for 41 years, the specific house in Denver that the carpenter had built in the form a carpenter builds the house he lives in, the careful form, the specific quality of the work visible in the details. He had been in the house in the illness form, the organized form of the medical equipment, and the specific form of the space that the hospice care produces in a house. I had been in the house in the form of the person receiving the house in the fuller form, the house as the house in which my father had been coming 3 times a week for 3 years. I had been in the house in the form of the person who knew that the house had been visited by my father in the care form across 3 years, and who was receiving the house with that knowledge. He had been in the chair in the living room. He had been in the form that the 81-year-old in the last months is in, diminished in the physical form, but present in the form I had known, the dignity still there, the earned the seat form still there inside the illness form. I had sat with him, I had said, I found out about Dad in the 3 years. He had been quiet for a long time. He had said, your father has been here. I want to say something about what my grandfather had said in the March visit, and about what the saying had been. He had said, your father has been here. He had said it in the form of the statement that contains the full weight of the 3 years in the 4 words. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to tell you something about your father across the 3 years. He had said, your father has been in the form of the person who shows up for the thing that is real. He had said, the showing up for the thing that is real is a specific form. He had said, not everyone has the form. He had said, your father has it. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to tell you something about the showing up form. He had said, the showing up form is the form in which you are present for the thing in the way the thing requires, rather than the way you prefer. He had said, I have not always required the pleasant form. He had said, the 3 years have had the difficult form. He had said, your father has been present for the difficult form. He had been quiet. He had said, the showing up for the difficult form is the form I needed. He had said, he gave me the form I needed. He had been quiet. He had said, I want you to know that. I had said, yes. He had said, yes. The form had been what was needed. My father had given the form. I want to say something about the seismology research I had been doing in the spring, and about what the research had been in conversation with what the Thursday call had produced. I had been working on a study of the crustal deformation in the Colorado Front Range, the specific form of the geodetic work that measures the slow movement of the Earth's surface using the GPS and the INSAR techniques. The deformation measurements had been building the picture of the strain accumulation across the region, the slow, millimeter-scale movement of the surface that the geodetic instruments could measure, and that told you about the deep fault behavior below. The surface movement was small. The deep accumulation was significant. The ratio between the surface expression and the deep accumulation had been the specific form of the measurement that the research had been producing. I had been doing the ratio analysis with the Thursday call in the background. Both had been the same form of the work in different registers. The measurement of the deep accumulation from the surface expression, the understanding of the deep structure from what was visible above. The 3 years of my father's care had been in the deep structure. The Thursday call had been my first instrument. The instrument had been showing me the deep structure from the surface expression for the first time. I want to say something about what had produced the 3 years, and about what my father had told me about the beginning. He had said, I want to tell you about how the 3 years started. He had said, I had been visiting your grandfather on a Sunday in January 3 years ago, and had been at the house for the ordinary Sunday visit, and had understood something. He had said, I understood from the specific form of the Sunday that your grandfather was in the form that required the managing. He had said, I did not receive the understanding in the dramatic form. He had said, I received it in the form of the recognizing. He had said, I recognized the form because I had seen it before in other contexts. He had said, the form was, this person needs the things managed and is not going to ask. He had said, your grandfather is the form of the person who does not ask. He had been quiet. He had said, I do not ask either. He had said, we are the same form in that specific way. He had said, I recognize the not asking form because I am in it. He had said, the recognizing produced the managing. He had been quiet. He had said, I want you to understand the sequence. He had said, the recognizing came first. He had said, the managing came from the recognizing. He had said, the managing was not the decision. He had said, the managing was the form the recognizing produced. I had said, yes. He had said, yes. The recognizing had produced the managing. The managing had been the form. I want to say something about the seismology parallel and about the concept of the body wave and what the body wave had given me for understanding the 3 years. In seismology, the body wave is the seismic wave that travels through the interior of the Earth rather than along the surface. The P wave and the S wave that propagate through the deep structure and that carry the information about the deep Earth that the surface wave cannot access. The body wave reveals the interior. The surface wave reveals the surface. To understand the deep structure, you need the body wave. My father had been the body wave of the relationship between him and his father. The information about what was happening in the deep structure of that relationship had been traveling through him rather than along the surface. The surface had been quiet. The body wave had been propagating through the interior for 3 years. The Thursday call had been the seismograph that had detected the body wave. The detection had given me the deep structure. The deep structure had been there the whole time. The body wave had been carrying the information. The seismograph had been my aunt's call. The detecting had changed the picture of the interior. I want to say something about a second visit to my grandfather in April, and about what happened in the visit that had changed the form of what I understood about the two of them. I had been at the house on a Saturday afternoon, and my father had been there when I arrived. Both of us had been in the house at the same time. I had been in the specific form of the watching of the 2 men who had been in the care form together for 3 years and who were now in it with me present. I had been watching my father in the care form. The care form had been the specific form I had not seen before the Thursday call. The organized and present form applied to the managing of his father's comfort and the appointments, and the specific form of the caregiving that the illness required. He had been in the house in the form of the person who knew the house in the specific way that the person who has been in the house 3 times a week for 3 years knows the house. He knew where the medications were. He knew the specific form the afternoon required. He had been in the house in the knowing the house form that I had not known he had. I had been watching the knowing the house form. The knowing the house form had been the evidence of the 3 years made visible. The 3 years had been visible in the knowing. The knowing had been the surface expression of the deep structure. I want to say something about what my grandfather had said to me in the April visit, when my father had stepped out of the room and we had been alone for a few minutes. He had said, I want to tell you something about your father when he is not here to hear it. He had said, your father has been in the form of the son I needed in this form. He had been quiet. He had said, I was not easy in my life. He had said, I was in the form of the man who did the work and who was not always easy to be with in the form of the being with. He had said, the carpenter's form is the form of the person in the work. He had said, I was in the work for 40 years. He had said, the being with had not always been the form I gave. He had been quiet. He had said, your father has given me the being with in these 3 years. He had said, not only the managing, he had said, the being with. He had said, I want you to understand that your father gave me the being with that I did not always give him. He had been quiet. He had said, that is a specific thing to give. He had said, I want you to know he gave it. He had been quiet. He had said, I know it cost him something to give it. He had been quiet. He had said, I am grateful. He had said it in the specific form of the gratitude that the man who does not express gratitude easily gives when he gives it. I had said, yes. He had said yes. I want to say something about the most significant conversation I had with my father in the months after the Thursday call and about when it had happened. He had called on a Sunday in May, 3 months after the Thursday call, and had been in the established form, the Sunday evening call, the account of the week. Near the end of the call he had said, I want to tell you something about the 3 years that I have not told you yet. I had said, tell me. He had said, I want to tell you about the specific thing that the 3 years have given me. He had said, not the thing I gave. He had said, the thing the 3 years gave me. He had been quiet. He had said, the 3 years have given me the form of my father that I did not have before. He had said, I knew your grandfather in the surface form, the form that the child knows the parent in. He had said, the surface form is the form that the carpenter gave, the present in the organized way, the providing of the things. He had said, the 3 years have given me the interior form of your grandfather. He had said, the interior form is the man who was in the work for 40 years and who also had the specific interior that the work was not the complete expression of. He had said, I have been learning the interior form of my father across the 3 years. He had been quiet. He had said, the interior form is better than the surface form. He had said, I would not have the interior form without the 3 years. He had said, the 3 years were the price of the interior form. He had said, the price was worth it. I had said, yes. He had said, yes. The interior form had been worth the price. I want to say something about the seismology research and about the concept of the seismic tomography and what the tomography had given me for understanding what the 3 years had been. In seismology, the seismic tomography is the technique that uses the travel times of the seismic waves through the Earth to build the three-dimensional image of the Earth's interior. The variations in the wave speed that indicate the different temperatures and compositions in the interior. The tomography reveals the structure that no drill could reach, the subducting slabs, the mantle plumes, the specific form of the interior that the surface cannot show. The tomography is the reading of the deep form from the behavior of the waves. The 3 years of the care had been the tomographic survey of my grandfather's interior, the slow accumulation of the wave data from the thousands of hours of the being with, the building of the three-dimensional image of the interior form of the man that the surface form had not shown. My father had been the seismograph array across the 3 years, recording the waves, building the tomographic image, arriving at the interior form. He had given me the tomographic result in the May call. The interior form was better than the surface form. The tomography had revealed the interior. The interior was the gift of the 3 years. I want to say something about what had happened in the week in June when my grandfather had been in the specific form of the final weeks, and about what that week had produced. He had been in the hospice house for the last week. The family had been gathering in the form that families gather at the end. The aunts who had not known for 3 years, now present in the form of the gathered family, my mother, my father. My father had been in the hospice room in the form I had been watching since April, the knowing the room form, the organized and present form. He had been in the specific form of the person who has been in this form for 3 years and who is now in it in the final week with the whole family watching. The family had been watching the form they had not known about for 3 years. The watching had been producing the specific form of the receiving. The aunt who had been hurt by the not telling, now receiving the form that the not telling had been producing across the 3 years. I had been watching the watching. The family watching the form my father had been in for 3 years had been producing in them what the Thursday call had produced in me. The fuller picture of who he was. The fuller picture had been in the room. The room had held the fuller picture. The fuller picture had been good. I want to say something about the most recent Sunday call with my father, which had been 2 weeks before I started telling this story. He had called at 7 in the established form. We had been in the call for 40 minutes. He had been telling me about the week, the specific form of the week after my grandfather's passing, the specific things that the after requires. He had said near the end, I want to tell you something about what I understand now about the 3 years. I had said, tell me. He had said, I understand now that the 3 years were not the doing form. He had said, I thought I was in the doing form across the 3 years. He had said, the doing form is the form that does the things. He had said, I was also in the being with form. He had said, the being with form and the doing form are different forms. He had said, I was in both simultaneously. He had said, The being with form was the form your grandfather received, he had said. The doing form was the form the appointments received. He had been quiet, he had said. I want to be in the being with form for the people I love, he had said. Not only the doing form, he had said, the being with form requires the quiet. He had said, the quiet is the condition for the being with. He had been quiet. He had said, the quiet was right for the 3 years. I had said, yes. He had said yes. The quiet had been right. The being with had been the form. The form was good. I want to say something about what the 3 years and the years since the Thursday call have given me for the seismology research, and about what the inside understanding has added to the professional form. I have been studying the deep structure for 5 years in the form of the scientists who found the deep structure analytically interesting, the fault mechanics, the strain accumulation, the seismic tomography. The work had been good in that form. The Thursday call had given me the inside understanding of the deep structure as the form that is real and significant, and doing the real work below the surface that registers nothing above. The inside understanding had not changed the technical methods. The inside understanding had changed the form of the receiving of the deep structure results. The awareness that the deep structure is the real structure, that the surface expression is the partial expression, that the understanding of what is happening requires the instrument that can read the deep. The professional instruments and the Thursday call had both been the instruments for the reading of the deep. The professional instruments had been the GPS and the seismograph. The Thursday call had been my aunt. Both had produced the deep structure reading. The deep structure reading had been the fuller understanding. The fuller understanding was good. The 3 years had been the deep structure. The reading had arrived. The reading was good. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story connected with something real in your life, write it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you have a parent or a person you love who has been doing the significant thing in the quiet form, the form that does not announce the doing, I want to say something clearly before you go. The quiet form is a real form of the love. The unannounced care that accumulates across the years is the accumulation of the strain in the deep structure. Real, significant, doing the real work below the surface expression. The instrument that reads the deep structure shows you the real picture. Ask about what they have been doing when no one was watching. The asking is the instrument. The instrument reveals the interior. The interior is the person. The interior form of the person is better than the surface form. The surface form is real. The interior is the fuller picture. Ask for the fuller picture. I want to say something about Grandpa Thomas and about what I had known of him before the Thursday call, and about what the Thursday call had given me for the fuller picture. He had been in the form I had known him across the 31 years of my life, the specific form of the grandfather who had been in the organized and dignified form, the carpenter who had shown up for the holidays and who had been at the head of the table in the specific form. He had built the bookshelves in my parents' house. He had built the shelves in his own house. He had built things that had lasted and that you could see were built to last. The built things that last form had been the surface form I had known. The Thursday call had told me my father had been learning the interior form for 3 years. The interior form was the form beneath the built things that last surface. The specific man who was inside the carpenter, the specific quality of the person who had been the father to my father across the years that my father had been the child and the adult son. I had not known the interior form. My father had been learning the interior form 3 times a week for 3 years. The Thursday call had started giving me the interior form at second hand through the account my father had been giving me since the Thursday. I want to say something about the specific form of the not asking that my father had identified as the shared form between him and his father, and about what the shared form had produced. He had said, "We are the same form in that specific way." The not asking form had been the form that both of them had been in. The not asking form is the form of the person who manages the things that need managing without requiring the help to be offered or the need to be acknowledged. Both of them had been in this form across the full duration of my father's life. My father had been in the not asking form across the 3 years, the managing without telling, the doing without announcing, the being in the form without requiring the knowing. My grandfather had been in the not asking form across the illness, the accepting of the managing my father was doing without asking for it, and without acknowledging in the explicit form that it was being done. Both had been in the not asking form simultaneously across 3 years. The form they shared had been the form the care had taken. The care had been possible in the quiet form because both of them had the quiet form. The shared quiet form had been the specific form of the recognition. My father had recognized the form because he was in it. The being in it had produced the recognizing. The recognizing had produced the care. The care had been real. I want to say something about the Thursday call in the specific form it had taken after the account of why he had not told anyone, and after I had said yes and he had said yes, I had said, I want to ask you something else. He had been quiet. He had said, ask. I had said, I want to know what the 3 years have been like, not the managing form. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to answer that. He had said, the 3 years have been the form of the learning. He had said, not the formal form of the learning. He had said, the learning that the being with produces. He had said, I have been learning my father for 3 years. He had been quiet. He had said, I want to tell you what I mean. He had said, I knew your grandfather in the form that the son knows the father across the adult years. The family occasions, the holidays, the specific form of the maintained relationship. He had said, the maintained relationship form is the surface form. He had said, the 3 years have been the form below the surface. He had said, I have been in the form below the surface for 3 years. He had been quiet. He had said, I know things about your grandfather now that the surface form never produced. He had said, the interior form of your grandfather is the form I have been learning. He had said, the interior form is the better form. I had said, yes. He had said yes. The interior form had been better. The learning had been real. I want to say something about my mother and about what she had told me when I had called her after the call with my father. Her name is Patricia. She is 56 years old. She had answered and I had said, did you know about Dad and Grandpa? She had been very quiet. She had said, yes. I had said, you knew. She had said, I found out 6 months ago. She had said, I found out the same way your aunt found out. Something the hospice nurse said. She had been quiet. She had said, I want to tell you something about what I did when I found out. She had said, I asked your father about it. She had said, he told me the same things he told you. She had said, I want to tell you what I said to him. She had said, I said, Robert, I have been married to you for 33 years and I did not know about this. She had been quiet. She had said, he said, I did not tell you because the telling to you would have made it the family form. He had said, the family form would have produced the managing together form. He had said, I needed the form between me and my father. She had been quiet. She had said, I want to tell you something about receiving that from your father. She had said, I received it in the form that the wife receives the thing that the husband did without telling her. She had said, the form that the wife receives is, this is a person who is more than the form I have been receiving. She had been quiet. She had said, I have been receiving a fuller form of your father since I found out. She had been quiet. She had said, the fuller form is good. I want to say something about the seismology research and about the concept of the seismic quiescence and what the quiescence had given me for understanding the 3 years of the quiet care. In seismology, the seismic quiescence is the period of the reduced seismic activity that sometimes precedes the major seismic event. The faults that have been producing the small earthquakes in the regular form sometimes go quiet before the large event. The small seismicity dropping below the background level as the fault locks and begins the accelerated strain accumulation. The quiescence is the quiet before the significant. The quiet is not the absence of the activity. The activity is happening in the deep form. The strain is accumulating. The fault is loading. The quiet is the surface expression of the deep loading. The 3 years of my father's quiet care had been the seismic quiescence. The surface quiet, that was the surface expression of the deep loading in the relationship between the two men. The quiet had been the surface form. The 3 years of the appointments and the visits and the managing had been the deep form. The surface had been quiet. The deep form had been doing the real work. The Thursday call had been the seismograph detecting the quiescence for what it was, the surface expression of the deep loading. I want to say something about the April visit, and about a specific conversation I had had with my father at the house on the Saturday when both of us had been there. My father had been in the kitchen making the specific preparations that the afternoon required, and I had been in the kitchen with him in the form of the person who was watching the knowing the kitchen form. He had been moving through the kitchen in the specific form of the person who knew where everything was, because he had been in this kitchen 3 times a week for 3 years. He had known where the medications were on the shelf, and he had known the specific form of the afternoon routine, and he had been in the kitchen in the full knowing form. I had been watching the knowing form. He had looked up and had caught me watching. He had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "I know where everything is." I had said, "Yes." He had been quiet. He had said, "I want to tell you something about the knowing." He had said, "The knowing is the evidence of the time." He had said, "You know the things in the place you have been 3 times a week for 3 years." He had said, "The knowing is the record of the being here." He had been quiet. He had said, "I want you to receive the knowing as the record." He had said, "Not the knowing as the competence." He had said, "The knowing as the record." I had said, "Yes." He had said, "Yes." The knowing had been the record. The record of the 3 years had been visible in the knowing. I want to say something about what my Aunt Donna had said in a call in May, 3 months after the Thursday call, after she had been in the hospice room across the weeks and had been receiving the fuller form of my father across that time. She had called on a Sunday and had said, "I want to tell you something about what the weeks in the hospice room have been giving me." I had said, "Tell me." She had said, "I have been in the hospice room and I have been watching your father be in the room with your grandfather." She had said, "The form he is in with your grandfather in the hospice room is the form that I did not know he had." She had said, "The form he has in the room is the form of the person who has been in this form for 3 years." She had said, "The form is the knowing form and the being with form and the specific form of the presence that the room requires." She had been quiet. She had said, "I want to tell you something about what the watching has produced in me." She had said, "The watching has produced the receiving of my brother in the fuller form." She had said, "I did not have the fuller form of Robert before the weeks in the hospice room." She had said, "I had the maintained relationship form." She had been quiet. She had said, "The fuller form is a better form." She had said, "I would not have the fuller form without the hospice room." She had been quiet. She had said, "I want to tell you that I am grateful for the hospice room." She had said, "Even given the circumstances." I had said, "Yes." She had said, "Yes." The room had given her the fuller form. The fuller form was good. I want to say something about a specific Sunday afternoon at the house in the second visit in April, and about the specific thing that had happened between my grandfather and my father while I had been there. They had been in the living room, my grandfather in the chair, my father on the couch. I had been in the chair by the window. The afternoon had been in the form of the 3 people in the room in the specific form of the late afternoon. My grandfather had been in the form of the person who was tired in the specific way the illness produces. My father had been reading, the specific form of the reading that the person does when they are in the room with someone who needs the presence but not the talking. He had been reading and being there. My grandfather had said my father's name, not the asking for something form, the naming form. My father had looked up. My grandfather had said, "You're here." My father had said yes. My grandfather had said good. He had gone back to the tired form. My father had gone back to the reading. I had been in the chair by the window in the form of the witness. The form I had witnessed had been, "You're here, yes, good." The 3 words of the acknowledgement had contained the 3 years of the being there. The 3 years had been in the 3 words. The 3 words had been enough. The acknowledgement had been complete. I want to say something about the seismology research and about a specific field trip I had made in the spring to the Colorado Front Range to do the geodetic measurements, and about what the field measurements had been in conversation with the year. I had been at the specific measurement sites along the Front Range, collecting the GPS data and the INSAR observations that fed into the strain accumulation model. The measurement sites had been the surface points from which the deep structure could be read, the specific locations where the surface deformation was measurable, and where the measurements accumulated across the months built the picture of what was happening in the deep. I had been at the measurement sites in May with the Thursday call in the background of the measuring. The measurement sites and my father had been in the same thought. Both had been the surface expressions from which the deep structure was readable. Both had been the points of access to the interior that the interior itself did not provide. The GPS monuments in the Front Range and my father's Sunday calls had both been the instruments that read the deep. The deep structure of the relationship between my father and his father had been readable from the surface expression of the Sunday calls and the Thursday account in the same way that the deep fault structure had been readable from the surface deformation at the measurement sites. The instruments had been reading. The reading had been producing the picture. I want to say something about what my father had told me in August, 6 months after the Thursday call, about the specific form of the 3 years that had been the hardest. He had called on a Sunday and had said, "I want to tell you something about the 3 years that I have been carrying since the Thursday call when you asked the full account." He had said, "I want to tell you about the specific form of the hardest part." He had said, "The hardest part was not the managing." He had said, "The managing is the form I know." He had been quiet. He had said, "The hardest part was the specific form of the watching." He had said, "I have been watching my father move from the form he had been in to the form the illness produces." He had said, "The watching form is the form that costs the most." He had said, "The managing does something with the watching form." He had said, "The managing gives the watching a form." He had said, "If I had not been managing, I would have only been watching." He had said, "The managing had been the form that made the watching possible without the watching being only the watching." He had been quiet. He had said, "I want to tell you something about that." He had said, "The managing was my form of the being present for the watching." He had said, "Not the watching from the distance." He had said, "The watching while doing." He had said, "The watching while doing is the form I had for being in the room with the loss." He had been quiet. He had said, "The loss is real." I had said, "Yes." He had said, "Yes." The loss was real. The managing had been the form for the being present for the loss. I want to say something about the most recent Sunday call with my father and about what the call had been in the form the year since the Thursday call had arrived at. He had called 2 weeks before I started telling this story. We had been in the call for 45 minutes in the established form. He had been in the form of the person who was in the months after the loss, the specific form of the person managing the after, the forms the after requires. He had said near the end, "I want to tell you something about what has changed since the Thursday call." I had said, "Tell me." He had said, "Since the Thursday call you have been in the form of the person who knows about the 3 years." He had been quiet. He had said, "The knowing has changed the form of the Sunday calls." He had said, "The Sunday calls before the Thursday call were the established relationship form." He had said, "The Sunday calls since the Thursday call are the fuller form." He had said, "The fuller form includes the 3 years." He had said, "I am in the Sunday call in the form of the father whose daughter knows the 3 years." He had been quiet. He had said, "The known form is a different form from the unknown form." He had said, "The known form is better." He had been quiet. He had said, "I should have told you sooner." He had been quiet. He had said, "The knowing makes the form between us fuller." I had said, "Yes." He had said, "Yes." The known form was fuller. The fuller was good. I want to say something about the seismology parallel and about the concept of the aftershock sequence and what the aftershock sequence had given me for understanding the year since the Thursday call. In seismology, the aftershock sequence is the series of smaller seismic events that follow the main shock. The fault that has ruptured in the main event continues to adjust to the new stress state through the aftershocks. the smaller releases that continue for days or weeks or months after the main event. The aftershock sequence is the fault working out the new equilibrium after the rupture. The Thursday call had been the main shock, the rupture of the surface quiet that had been building for 3 years. The year since had been the aftershock sequence, the working out of the new equilibrium in the relationship, the smaller releases, the May conversation, the August conversation, the October Sunday calls, that had been adjusting the relationship to the new state the Thursday call had produced. The new equilibrium had been arriving gradually across the aftershock sequence. The new equilibrium was the fuller form of the Sunday calls. The fuller form was the new equilibrium. The aftershock sequence had been producing the new equilibrium. The new equilibrium was good. The fault had found the new form. The form was good. I want to say something about what the 3 years have given me for understanding my father, and about what the year since the Thursday call has given me for understanding who he is in the fuller form. I had known my father in the surface form across 31 years, the organized and competent and quiet form, the form that managed the practical matters without the announcement. The Thursday call had given me the same form at the large scale, the same competence and quiet and organizing applied to the 3 years of the care. The fuller form was the same form at the scale that revealed what the form really was. The smaller scale had shown me the form. The larger scale had shown me what the form was made of, the specific quality of the love that does not require the knowing of the doing, the being with form that requires the quiet, the interior form that the doing with the being with over 3 years produces. The smaller scale form had been real. The larger scale form had been the same form more fully expressed. The more fully expressed form was better in the sense that the high-resolution tomographic image is better than the low-resolution image. Both are images of the same interior. The high-resolution shows more of what's there. The year since the Thursday call had been the high-resolution image. The image was good, the interior was good, the form was good. I want to say something about the Tuesday after my grandfather's passing and about what that Tuesday had been. He had called on a Tuesday. The form I had not known was established, but that had been my father's way of saying the not established calling. The calling because I wanted to call. He had called on the Tuesday after the passing. He had been in the form of the person in the immediate after. He had said, "I want to call you on a Tuesday." I had said, "Yes." He had been quiet. He had said, "I want to tell you something about what this week has been." He had given me the account, the specific form of the week after, the things the week required. Near the end of the call he had said, "I want to tell you something about the 3 years now that they are the 3 years." He had said, "The 3 years are the 3 years now." He had said, "They are not the ongoing form." He had said, "They are the completed form." He had been quiet. He had said, "The completed form has a specific quality." He had said, "The completed form is the form that can be fully known because it is fully there." He had said, "I can give you the full account now." He had been quiet. He had said, "I could not give you the full account while the 3 years were happening because the account would have changed the form." He had said, "The 3 years are complete now." He had said, "I want to give you the full account." He had said, "The full account is yours to have." I had said, "Yes." He had said, "Yes." The full account was mine. The mine was good. I want to say something about a conversation I had with a colleague at the research center, a geodesist named Dr. Reyes, who had been working alongside me for 4 years and who had known me through the Thursday call year. She had said in October, "I want to ask you something about the seismology and the father story." She had said, "The seismology is the reading of the deep structure from the surface expression." She had said, "You have been doing that at work and at home this year." I had said, "Yes." She had said, "I want to ask you something about the difference between the 2 readings." She had said, "The professional reading uses the instruments." She had said, "What was the instrument for the family reading?" I had been quiet. I had said, "The instrument was my aunt's call." She had said, "Yes." She had said, "One instrument." She had been quiet. She had said, "The professional reading uses many instruments distributed across the region." She had said, "The family reading had one instrument, and the one instrument gave you the reading." I had said, "Yes." She had said, the one instrument was sufficient. I had said, yes. She had been quiet. She had said, I want to tell you something about the instrument problem. She had said, the instrument problem in the family reading is, the deep structure was real for 3 years before the instrument was available. She had been quiet. She had said, the deep structure does not require the instrument to be real. I had said yes. She had said yes. She had said, the 3 years were real without your knowing. I had said yes. She had said yes. The real had not required the knowing. The real had been real. I want to say something about what the year has given me in the form of the understanding of what the quiet form is and is not. I had grown up receiving the quiet form as the form of the competent man, the thing that gets done without the announcement, the managing without the performance of the managing. I had received that as his style. The year since the Thursday call had given me the understanding that the quiet form is not the style. The quiet form is the specific form of the love that does not need the knowing to be complete. The love that does not need the knowing to be complete is not the indifferent form. The indifferent form also does not need the knowing to be complete, but for the different reason. The indifferent form does not need the knowing because the knowing does not matter. The quiet form of the love does not need the knowing because the love is complete in the doing rather than in the acknowledging of the doing. The doing is the love. The acknowledging would not add to the love, it would change the form of the love. My father had said, the telling would have changed the form of the doing. The telling would have changed the doing from the complete form to the announced form. The announced form is real. The quiet form is also real. Both are forms of the love. The quiet form is the form that does not require the acknowledgement to be what it is. The quiet form was his form. The form was good. I want to say one last thing about the 3 years and about the You're Here exchange and what the exchange had been. My grandfather had said, You're here. My father had said, yes. My grandfather had said, good. The 3 words had been the acknowledgement of the 3 years. Not all 3 words had been my grandfather's. 1 had been my father's. The exchange had been 3 words, 2 speakers, 3 years contained. The acknowledgement had been the surface expression of the 3 years of the deep loading. The deep loading had produced the 3-word rupture. The rupture had been small in the seismic sense. The good form, the quiet form. The small rupture had been enough. The fault had adjusted to the new equilibrium. The equilibrium was, my father is here. The here is good. The acknowledgement required no more than that. The 3 words had contained the complete acknowledgement. The complete acknowledgement had been the surface expression of the 3 years. The 3 years had produced the acknowledgement. The acknowledgement had been the form the 3 years had been building toward. The form had arrived in the 3 words. The 3 words had been enough. The form was good. My father was here. That had been good. Good is the form. The form is good. I want to say something about my mother and about the fuller form of my father she had been receiving since she had found out 6 months before I found out. She had said, the fuller form is good. I had received that statement across the months and had been returning to it. The fuller form is good is the statement of the person who has had the partial form for 33 years and who has received the fuller form and who understands the difference. The partial form had been the form she had known for 33 years of the marriage, the organized and quiet and competent form. The fuller form had included the 3 years of the grandfather care. The fuller form had been the same form at the scale that revealed what the form was made of. She had been in the 33-year form and had then received the fuller form. The fuller form had been good in the same way that the high-resolution image is good, not because it replaced the previous image, but because it showed more of what was there. Both images had been of the same person. The high resolution had shown the interior. The interior had been there the whole time. The 33 years had been the time in which the interior had been accumulating the 3 years. The 3 years had been the event that the 33 years had been building toward. The fuller form was what the 33 years had been producing in the deep structure. The deep structure was good. I want to say something about the geodetic measurements and about what the strain accumulation model had been producing in the months after the Thursday call, and about what the model had been giving me for the personal understanding. The strain accumulation model had been showing the specific pattern of the accumulation across the Front Range faults, the locked sections building the elastic strain, the creeping sections releasing the strain in the slow and continuous form, the specific interplay between the locked and the creeping sections that determined the overall seismic hazard of the region. The locked sections were the sections that would produce the significant events. The creeping sections were the sections that were releasing the strain in the small continuous form. My father had been in the locked section form across the 3 years, accumulating the strain of the care and the being without the releasing. The Thursday call had been the releasing event. The release had been significant. The significant release from the lock section produces the surface expression that the creeping release does not. The Thursday call had been the significant surface expression. The significant expression had been good. The lock had been released. The strain had been named. The naming had been good. Both of us knew what the strain had been. Both were in the new equilibrium. The new equilibrium was the good form. I want to say something about what the year has given me for my understanding of the work, and about what the work has given the year. The seismology had been giving me the vocabulary across the year: the fault, the strain accumulation, the quiescence, the tomography, the aftershock sequence. The vocabulary had been the professional language that I had been using to receive the personal understanding. The personal understanding had been giving the professional vocabulary the inside form, the understanding of what the deep loading feels like from the position of the person who is in the deep loading, the understanding of what the quiescence looks like from the surface when the deep loading is happening below. I had been doing both the professional and the personal work in the same year. Both had been the reading of the deep structure from the surface expression. The professional work used the instruments. The personal year had used the Thursday call and the Sunday calls and the April visits and the year here exchange. Both had been the reading. The reading had produced the picture. The picture was the fuller form of my father. The fuller form was better than the surface form. Both were the same form at different resolutions. The high resolution was the gift of the year. The year had been good. The reading had been good. The deep structure was good.